And on the day that World War II breaks out, President Roosevelt declares American neutrality. In a speech to the American people, Roosevelt reflected on the events that had occurred and lays out his own vision of the world that he sees in the future. Roosevelt stating, "My fellow Americans and my friends, tonight my single duty is to speak to the whole of America. Until 4:30 this morning, I had hoped against hope that some miracle would prevent a devastating war in Europe and bring to an end the invasion of Poland by Germany. It is right, too, to point out that the unfortunate events of these recent years have, without question, been based on the use of force and or the threat of force. And it seems to me clear, even at the outbreak of this great war, that the influence of America should be consistent in seeking for humanity a final peace which will eliminate, as far as it's possible to do so, the continued use of force between nations. This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. Even a neutral has a right to take account of events. Even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or close his conscience. As long as it remains within my power to prevent, there will be no blackout of peace in the United States." One of the main reasons, outside of the fact that we were not attacked, so therefore you don't go to war unless you're attacked, one of the main reasons why Roosevelt declared neutrality is that Neville Chamberlain is still the head of the British government. And throughout the 1930s, Neville Chamberlain had been one of the main European supporters of Hitler. And while Neville Chamberlain had now officially declared war upon Hitler, he hadn't actually sent any soldiers. And Roosevelt believed somebody like Neville Chamberlain could not be trusted as an ally to take on Nazi Germany. So he said the United States would stay neutral. It's also important to point out that not all Americans were neutral when they found out about the outbreak of the war. 1 month after the war began, Alfred Sloan Jr., who was president of General Motors at this time, made a public statement to journalists stating, "It seems clear that the Allies are outclassed on mechanical equipment, and it is foolish to talk about modernizing their armies in times like these. They ought to have thought of that 5 years ago. There is no excuse for them of not thinking of that except for the unintelligent, in fact stupid, narrow-minded, and selfish leadership which the democracies of the world are cursed with. But when some other system develops stronger leadership, works hard and long, and intelligently and aggressively, which are all good traits, and superimposed upon that develops the instinct of a racketeer, then there is nothing for the democracies to do but fold up. And that is what it looks like they are going to do." This is Alfred Sloan saying General Motors is not neutral, GM knows which side it's on, and that General Motors is on the side of Nazi Germany, and that the democracies of the world are foolish governments, and that they should simply surrender and accept that Nazi Germany and fascism are the future of the world. Perhaps one of the greatest confusing parts of the early part of the war, journalists at the time used to argue that German soldiers utilized blitzkrieg tactics, while British and French soldiers utilized sitzkrieg tactics, because war had been declared, but British and French soldiers were just sitting there, not going on the attack at all. At the time, both the British and the French governments put out statements denouncing both the Nazi government and the Soviet government as aggressive force in the world who had brought World War II upon humanity. At the time, Joseph Stalin believed that the reason why Britain and France had not yet attacked Germany was that the British and French governments were in secret negotiations with Nazi Germany to join them as allies in an attack upon the Soviet Union to destroy Russia. While this might sound a bit paranoid, one of the things we need to understand about Joseph Stalin is that Stalin has spies in every single government throughout the world, which means that whenever anyone is trying to pull backdoor deals, Joseph Stalin knows about it. And his paranoia about the British and the French is completely correct. Behind the scenes, both the British and the French governments were negotiating with Adolf Hitler, trying to save the peace between their three nations, and to join Adolf Hitler in a war against the Soviet Union. What's going to change this is on May 10th, 1940, there is a vote of no confidence in the British Parliament against Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. That means that Neville Chamberlain was now fired from his job and replaced instead by Sir Winston Churchill. Hitler now realized that Winston Churchill was an individual who would not negotiate, who would not join his side, and who would carry on an actual war against Nazi Germany. So upon hearing that Churchill was now the new Prime Minister, German forces quickly opened up a war on the Western Front, which had never been the intention of Hitler since day number one of his political career. Very quickly, over 2 weeks, German forces overwhelmed the nations of Holland, Luxembourg, and Belgium. And when German forces arrived in the Dutch city of Rotterdam, and the Dutch people began resisting, the Germans intentionally targeted civilians and burnt Rotterdam to the ground, as a sign to the French people that if the French people resisted oncoming German forces, that cities like Paris would also be burnt to the ground. Due to this, on June 22nd, 1940, France is going to fall to Nazi Germany, with the French people surrendering. In the north part of France, throughout World War II, Germans will directly occupy these areas. And the southern parts of France that you see in white on the map, this is technically an independent French government that's called Vichy France, that technically is independent, but who are officially allies with Nazi Germany. The problem for the Vichy government is that during the 1930s, many famous Jews who had fled persecution in Germany and had resettled in France. And now that France was under German occupation, Marshal Pétain, who was going to be head of the Vichy government, almost immediately began rounding up as many Jews as possible without the Nazis even ordering it. And he began immediately contacting Hitler, requesting that French Jews who had now been rounded up be packed up on trains and deported to the camps in the east. Which now means Great Britain, in the summer of 1940, is the only major power in the world that's still fighting against Nazi Germany. And while this might sound heroic, since Britain is a small island nation, also keep in mind that Great Britain still controls a quarter of the world. So this is not just a matter of some tiny little island taking on the mighty force of Nazi Germany. Great Britain has more than enough resources to take on Germany alone, if necessary. We'll go ahead and end there, and when we come back on Wednesday, we'll talk more specifically about the early dynamics of World War II and about the greatest generation in American history.